if you don't have one of the old ones like I do, Swami Premananda Teachings and Reminiscences, you probably have the new one titled Memories of a Loving Soul. And I can't say whether the pages are going to be the same. But I'm going to start with the introduction because that gives a brief overview of his life. And Swami Premananda, as you know, was one of the first monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna when they formed the monastery. See, his pre-monastic name, when you read about him in the Gospel, is Babaram. Babaram was there, and that's Swami Premananda. So we will start with the introduction. Outwardly, there's very little to distinguish a saint from an ordinary man. In most instances, he appears to us as a somewhat simple, unobtrusive figure, and with the possible exception of a few, his name remains unknown to the world at large. The greatness of such men lies elsewhere. Perhaps that is why the biographer, should he seek to communicate that greatness, finds his task so difficult, and if satisfied with only a superficial account, seldom touches the real man. Much of the saint is shrouded in obscurity. The majority of his life is lived within, where the author is barred from venturing. He eludes investigation because the very nature of his saintliness exists beyond the descriptive power of words or the capacity of common understanding. As knowers of God, they contain some of his mystery and profoundness. And like him, they will remain largely incomprehensible to those who are yet unfitted to bear the awesome weight of spiritual knowledge. Swami Premananda possessed to the fullest degree the characteristics we have mentioned. Saintliness shone in him. His purity is irreproachable. In fact, so unblemished was his character that Sri Ramakrishna was once moved to remark, "Babaram is pure to his very marrow. No impure thought can ever cross his mind." Many others also attested to this absolute stainlessness, and indeed, to the end of his life, he evidenced a childlike simplicity and guilelessness noticed by all who made his acquaintance. He was also of a very loving nature. Many of the young monks who came under his supervision remember that although he could be a stern taskmaster at times and issue severe scoldings, all of his reprimands were suffused with a love which flowed to them in 100 different directions. A senior Swami of the Ramakrishna order recalls this incident in his own experience. Just after I joined the order at the Belur Monastery, I happened to be present when Swami Premananda was severely scolding a young monk. I said to myself, this holy man loses his temper. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, Swami Premananda suddenly turned to me and smiled. I knew that his anger was never a real anger, but only employed as a means to instruct us. From that moment on, I could never be upset when he scolded me. On the other hand, I felt a strange undercurrent of joy and considered his reprimands to be a blessing. Swami Premananda was born on December 10th, 1861, in the prosperous village of Anpur in the Hooghly district of Bengal. His parents gave him the name of Babaram. His sister was married to Balaram Bose, a wealthy devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. I think if you're familiar with the gospel readings, Ramakrishna was always going to Balaram's house, and they stayed in Balaram's home in Vrindavan. Balaram was very important to Sri Ramakrishna. Both his mother and father were noble and pious villagers, and we may assume they were highly pleased when Baburam began to show evidence of a strong spiritual nature. From a very early age, perhaps 5 or 6, the young boy was prompted toward living a holy life. Even then, he was heard to protest if anyone would tease him about marriage. "Don't make me marry, don't," he would cry. "I shall die if you do." At the age of 8, his greatest desire was to live apart from the world, in a small hut surrounded by trees. Baburam would often visit the ascetics who lived along the banks of the Ganges, and perhaps it was they who inspired him with the idea of leading a solitary life. However, these thoughts did not in any way cloud his warm, sweet nature, which drew the attention of his classmates and inspired their affection. After completing his elementary schooling, Baburam went to Calcutta for higher studies. It was there he entered the Metropolitan Institution at nearby Shampurpur, where Mahendranath Gupta, M., the author of the Gospel, served as a headmaster. By another curious coincidence, it was also there that Baburam made the acquaintance of Rakhal, Swami Premananda, and the two of them soon became fast friends. About this time, Rakhal was just starting to visit Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshineshwar, where the latter was employed as a priest of the Kali temple. When Rakhal described the great holiness of Ramakrishna to Baburam, the boy expressed an immediate desire to meet him. Therefore, Rakhal asked his friend whether he would like to spend the night at Dakshineshwar. Baburam, at first thinking that they were to visit a monk who lived only in a small hut, said somewhat apprehensively, "But where will we sleep? Is there room?" "There might be," answered Rakhal. "What shall we have to eat at night?" asked Baburam. "We shall manage," Rakhal said, strangely unperturbed. Now everyone has to know that Rakhal, Swami Premananda, had a wicked sense of humor. It wasn't there to hurt anyone, but he always had a sense of humor. The two of them left for Dakshineshwar the following Saturday, arriving at sunset. It was the month of November, 1882. Less than 4 years remained in Ramakrishna's life, but they were to be immensely valuable years. He was now to begin the final gathering of his disciples, and through the lesson of parable, the weight of philosophical truth, and most of all, through the overpowering influence of his own spiritual presence, to mold these young men into fit instruments for his work. Some of them, such as Swami Vivekananda, were to speak before large audiences in the United States and eventually draw the attention of the world. Others, like Swami Premananda, would lecture and travel rarely, but all of them without exception were to receive the grace of the Master and carry out his divine instructions according to their own particular capacities and qualifications. Baburam's initial reaction to Dakshineshwar was one of delight. He was immediately charmed by its beauty and tranquil atmosphere. And indeed, the high domed Kali temple, towering like a proud mother over the wide courtyard and rows of smaller temples below, must have been an impressive sight to the spiritually precocious young man. Ramakrishna was not in his room when the young men entered it. Rakhal at once sensed that he was needed, for he excused himself and went to the temple in search of the master. A few minutes later he returned, leading Ramakrishna, who was in a God-intoxicated state, by the hand. Rakhal was carefully guiding his steps, warning him of the high and low places. After entering the room, Ramakrishna sat on the small bed and gradually began to return to consciousness of the outer world. When Baburam was introduced to him, Ramakrishna immediately said, "Ah, so you were a relative of Balaram. Then you were related to us also." After a few more questions, he caught hold of Baburam's hand and said, "Come closer to the light. Let me see your face." In the dim light of an earthen lamp, he carefully scrutinized the features of the young man. Then he examined the young man's arms and legs. Finally, he weighed his forearm by placing it on his palm and nodded approvingly. Apparently satisfied with all these physical tests, Ramakrishna said, "All right, all right." It was not an unusual practice for him to employ this method of assessing a man's character. He had on several occasions remarked that physical characteristics can be a strong indication of a person's spiritual development or emotional temperament. He would frequently say that the hand of a deceitful person is heavy, or that squint-eyed people are often wicked. On the other hand, eyes that are lotus-shaped belong to people with good thoughts, and those of a yogi have a reddish and upward cast. That night, Baburam slept just outside Ramakrishna's room. Now, if any of you have, when you go to Dakshineshwar, Ramakrishna's room is a fairly large room in the compound, and it has a fairly large veranda porch all the way around. So when Baburam was so worried about where he would sleep in this small hut that he imagined, it wasn't like that. There was quite enough room to sleep. No sooner had he fallen asleep than a most unusual thing happened. He was awakened by the presence of Ramakrishna, who was whispering excitedly to Ramdayal, Baburam's companion on the veranda, "Please tell Narendra to come here." Ramakrishna was saying, his voice trembling with anguish, "I feel as though someone were wringing my heart like this," and he twisted the cloth he was wearing tightly, as though wringing water from it. "Ah, he is as pure as Narayan himself." He's speaking of Narendra, Swami Vivekananda. "I cannot bear life without him." Ramakrishna left the boys and returned an hour or so later, still upset. This continued at hourly intervals throughout the night. Such unusual behavior of Ramakrishna, despite its strangeness, deeply touched Baburam. What affection this holy man has for Narendra, he thought to himself. But at the same time, he was puzzled over Narendra's apparent neglect of the master. Narendra was later to become Swami Vivekananda. The next morning he found Ramakrishna seated joyfully in his room, his face peaceful and serene, a sharp contrast to the night before. Baburam took his leave, and Ramakrishna asked him to come again soon. The visit left a strong impression on the young man, and he promised himself that he would return on the following Sunday. He arrived in Dakshineshwar on the appointed day, and Ramakrishna welcomed him with a smile. "It is nice you could come. Why don't you go out to the Panchavati? It's a small grove planted with sacred trees and designed as a place in which to practice spiritual disciplines. The trees are planted in a circle with an altar in the center. And it's where Ramakrishna often went to meditate. They are having a picnic there, and you can meet Narendra. Baburam obeyed the suggestion and walked the short distance to the grove where Ramakrishna himself had planted the 5 sacred trees with his nephew Hridoy and had undergone severe austerities for many years. Almost immediately, he recognized this place to be a nearly exact replica of the secluded hermitage that he had envisioned in his early boyhood. Within Baburam, there was beginning to form the vague realization that his relationship to Ramakrishna stretched far beyond the limits of his present understanding, and that a number of mysterious and profound links joined him to this gentle holy man, the full significance of which only the years to follow would reveal. We have read in the accounts of Sri Ramakrishna's life of his unusual sensitivity to impurity in any form. If a person whom he considered immoral even so much as touched a cup or dish from which he was about to eat, he would almost immediately experience an unpleasant reaction. The touch of money or of an impure person would cause him actual physical pain. The Holy Mother, Sri Sarda Devi, had similar reactions and is known to have suffered a burning in the feet from the touch of too many worldly people. Almost at their first meeting, Ramakrishna seemed to sense Baburam's purity. In time, the master found that when he entered certain ecstatic states, only Baburam was able to touch him. Such a state comes on me during ecstasy, he once said, that I can touch Baburam only. If he holds me, then I don't feel pain. If he feeds me, I can eat. M. recorded this conversation in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna between himself and the master concerning the latter's opinion of Baburam. Master, yesterday I came to know Baburam's inner nature. That is why I've been trying so hard to persuade him to live with me. The mother bird hatches the egg in proper time. Boys like Baburam are pure in heart. They have not yet fallen into the clutches of lust and greed. Isn't that so? M. It is true, sir. They are still stainless. Master. They are like a new pot. Milk kept in it will not turn sour. M. Yes, sir. Master. I need Baburam here. I pass through certain spiritual states when I need someone like him. He says he must not, all at once, live with me permanently, for it will create difficulties. His relatives will make trouble. I am asking him to come here Saturdays and Sundays. This took place on June 30th, 1884, more than a year and a half since Baburam's first meeting with Ramakrishna. So we may assume Baburam's studies and responsibilities at home were keeping him from any visits longer than a weekend. Sri Ramakrishna had been cautious. He did not want to disrupt family relationships any more than was necessary. A week earlier, he had told M, I don't want Baburam to tear himself away from his family. It may make trouble at home. But despite all remonstrances, even from Ramakrishna himself, Baburam was finding school insipid and uninteresting. He began to neglect his education. However, he was still unsure whether or not to completely abandon his studies. On one occasion, Ramakrishna tested the boy's interest by asking him, "Where are your books? Don't you intend to finish your studies?" Then he turned to him and added that Baburam wants to have both, meaning the world and God. "That is very difficult," Ramakrishna said. "What will you gain by knowing God partially?" Vashishta, though a great saint, was grief-stricken over the death of his son. This amazed Lakshmana, the brother of Rama, and he asked Rama the reason. "What is there to wonder at?" Rama replied. "He who has knowledge also has ignorance. Go beyond both knowledge and ignorance. If a thorn enters the sole of your foot, you must get another thorn to take it out. Afterwards, you throw them both away. Likewise, one procures the thorn of knowledge to remove the thorn of ignorance, then one goes beyond them both." Baburam smiled and said, "That's what I want." "But my child, can you attain it by holding to both? If you want that, then come away," Ramakrishna answered. "You take me away from the world," the young disciple said with a smile. In later years, Swami Premananda would often speak of his motherly concern, of the motherly concern the master had for him and the rest of his young disciples. On one occasion, Hazra, the witty but calculating skeptic whom the master indulgently tolerated, said to Baburam, "Why don't you boys ask Ramakrishna for some powers? He gives you sweets to eat and you are satisfied. Don't be such fools. Ask him for something better." From his room, Ramakrishna noticed Hazra whispering these things to Baburam. And when the boy walked up to him, he asked him what Hazra had said. "He said I should ask you for occult powers," Baburam openly replied. At once, Sri Ramakrishna approached Hazra. "What nonsense are you teaching these boys?" He said sharply, "Why should they ask me for powers? Don't they know that everything I have belongs to them? I am their very own. They know their relationship to me. They won't ask me for this or that." The master's compassion for his young disciple knew no bounds. One night, while Baburam was fanning Sri Ramakrishna, the latter forced him to sleep on his own bed. Baburam insisted that such a thing would be sacrilegious, but Ramakrishna replied, "Outside the mosquitoes will bite you. I shall wake you if it is necessary." At other times, the master would come to Calcutta to see Baburam and feed him with sweets that he had brought from Dakshineshwar. Sometimes the long separation from Baburam would make the master cry like a child. The ecstatic states of Sri Ramakrishna and the holy atmosphere of Dakshineshwar began to sharpen Baburam's desire for an experience of God. He importuned Ramakrishna time and again to give him ecstasy. "I'll ask the Divine Mother," Ramakrishna replied. "Does anything happen by my will, my child?" Therefore he prayed to the Mother, imploring her to grant his young disciple an ecstatic experience. "Please, Mother, give Baburam a little bhava," ecstasy, he cried to her. Later he told his devotees that she said Baburam would not have bhava, but knowledge of God instead. This pleased the master. At least he will have that and find peace. I have been much worried about him. Let's see. Okay. Are there any questions or any comments about what we've read so far? Okay, we're just getting the light. Okay. During the final months of Sri Ramakrishna's life, he was moved to a garden house in the northwestern suburbs of Calcutta at Kasipur. Because of the distance involved, it was necessary for many of the young disciples to live with the Master rather than commute from their homes as before. Baburam was one of those who served him wholeheartedly at Kasipur. But the days remaining in the Master's life were few. Finally, at 2 minutes after 1 o'clock on Monday morning, August 16th, 1886, Ramakrishna entered Mahasamadhi and passed out of his body. The grief-stricken young monks, whose lives had been transformed by this gentle, loving God-man, suddenly found themselves terribly alone. And in the days to follow, the memory of his unbounded love, the tenderness and unfailing wisdom of his words, and the profound depth of his spirituality came back to them again and again. Sorrow, however, did not dampen their enthusiasm for a life of renunciation. A number of the Master's disciples soon moved into a dilapidated old house in Baranagar, near Calcutta, where they continued to practice severe austerities. In December, Baburam was asked by his mother to return home to Anandpur and bring Narendra with him. By the time they were ready to leave, however, 7 of their brother monks had joined them. Hi, Mom, we're coming home for the holidays. And together they journeyed to Baburam's village, singing religious songs the entire way. While in Anandpur, the boys spent many hours a day in meditation and spiritual talk. Then one evening, they built a large fire in the compound and seated themselves around it. They meditated for a long time together. Afterwards, Narendra spoke to them of renunciation and how Christ's disciples had gathered to carry on the teachings of Jesus. He quoted to them from St. Matthew, "The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." He urged his brothers to renounce the world once and for all, and carry the banner of eternal freedom out among the people of Christ, like as Christ's disciples had done. Later, they realized the evening they had met together had been Christmas Eve. Upon their return to Baranagar, they received their monastic names at the customary fire ceremony. Baburam became Swami Premananda, a name given him by Narendra, who thought it conformed to the remark of Ramakrishna that Radha, the goddess of love, was partially incarnated in Baburam. During his stay at Baranagar, Swami Premananda's mind was almost constantly immersed in the contemplation of Sri Ramakrishna. In reference to this, we have the following comment from Swami Turiyananda in a letter to his brother disciple dated November 20th, 1915. "In you, there is no room for anything else but the thought of the Lord. I remember once that you said everything reminded you of his presence. That day, I saw for the first time the truth realized by the gopis, that wherever their eyes fell, there was Krishna manifest. I do not know if you remember that, but in my own heart it remains impressed forever. I understand that day what it really means to be completely immersed in the Lord." It was a period of great joy and fraternal closeness for the small band of disciples, and later Premananda was to remark, "At Baranagar we would always see the good in every brother. None of us searched for fault in one another, but they were tested often." In order to instill discipline, Swami Vivekananda had made a ruling that the monks must rise at a certain hour in the morning. Those who disobeyed were required to live on alms for the rest of the day. One morning, Premananda failed to get up at the appointed time. In jest, Swami Vivekananda asked someone to ring the bell in Babaram's ear. At the sound of the bell, Premananda immediately realized he was late. He went to Vivekananda. "I was late, brother. You have made a ruling, and I am ready for my punishment." Swamiji's face grew suddenly serious. He looked at Premananda with infinite tenderness and said, "How could you ever think I would be able to administer such punishment to you?" As he uttered these words, tears began to roll down his cheeks. Premananda too was visibly moved, and tears also began to form in his eyes. At that moment, Swami Premananda gently intervened. "It is not a question of who is to be punished, but there is a ruling that he who fails to rise one time must live on alms for the remainder of the day." Swami Premananda left the monastery for alms. And we will stop there today. We have a big weekend coming up. Swami Yogamananda from Providence will be here Saturday, and we're going to have a retreat on The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. It will start at 10:30 in the morning here in the temple and go until 3 o'clock. Prasad lunch we'll have lunch in between. We won't sit for all those hours. We will get up and move around. And that's The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. I think many of us who were around in the 60s have definitely read it. Those of you who haven't, it's a wonderful book. Then Sunday, he will give a lecture, The Open Secret. And everyone's invited to come. I think those of you that can't be here in person, I think the Zoom links are already posted, aren't they? Zoom links are posted, so you can join us that way. Any questions or any comments? Swami Premananda became like the mother of Belur Math during the last part. During the last part of his life. He greeted everyone, took care of everyone, was there to treat every guest who came as if they were the Lord himself visiting. He set an example for, a really good example of how the attitude of see the divine in everyone can be personified. Okay? Then we will end. Om Shanti, 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 Hari Om Tat Sat, Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. And we'll see you. There will be no gospel reading on Saturday after the retreat. We'll have the Wednesday as usual next week. Okay.